I'm Elena van Stee, blog editor for Context Magazine, and today I'm very excited to welcome our special guest, Dr. Anthony Jack, to celebrate the publication of his new book titled Class Dismissed. So Dr. Jack is the inaugural faculty director of the Boston University Newbery Center and associate professor of higher education leadership at the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. His first book, The Privileged Poor, documented previously overlooked diversity among lower-income undergraduates at elite universities. And now his second book, which we're here to talk about today, examines how inequalities between students played out during the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, Tony, welcome to the blog.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so to start off, I want to pose a question to you that I know you've posed to many, many students over the course of this study, which is, I want you to return to the morning of March 10, 2020. So where were you when you received the notification that Harvard was asking students to leave campus, and what was your reaction?
I was on campus because that's where I lived at the time. I was a faculty fellow in actually one of the undergrad houses. And I knew it was coming because I was involved in some conversations before, and the prepping, you just knew it was coming, you just didn't know when. And I just remember waking up, seeing that email when it came in, because I'm an early riser. And I was just like, it's here. That's literally what I told myself. I was like, it's here. Just trying to figure out what the hell was going on, what was going to happen, what provisions were actually going to be provided for students. And I remember I actually emailed Claudine Gay when she was currently at the time she was the dean of the faculty. And I was just like, please, I outlined some things about going through. Yeah, it was a hard day because I knew it was the right decision, but I also knew it was going to be hard for so many who are already dealing with so much.
Totally. So tell me about, as the weeks and the months progressed, how did this turn from this source of concern for the students immediately around you to a formal research project?
Yeah, so I was actually going to be working on a book about work among college students, and I was going to actually break out of my mode of doing one school, and I wanted to do something more comparative, like one residential private college, one public university, and a community college to look at, different configurations of work. I got really interested with it in my last book. And then COVID hit, and I was just like, I'm not risking my life, and I'm not, the amount of energy that it would take to try to get someone on the phone and say, hey, I'm trying to do research at university. Come on, like that would be impossible during the time. So it was a pivot, actually. I was really like gearing up. I was reading Danny Schneider's work. I was reading other people, Sarah Susan Smith, and how they craft the books about work. And then everything kind of just got put on hold because of it. And so I made that pivot. And William Julius Wilson, approached me because he was on the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery Committee. And he said that, hey, Tony, there's a project on the Black undergraduate experience, and we're thinking about doing a survey. And I said, well, Bill, I know about the undergraduate experience, but I'm no survey researcher, right? You do not want me to do a survey. But he said, well, send us a proposal. And the proposal that I sent was a qualitative study to interview undergraduates, but not just Black undergraduates, because I said there's a comparative angle here that to show the full contours of inequality, I needed to break out of just studying Black students or just Black-white comparisons. And so with the backing of the Radcliffe Institute and also Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, I was able to interview this time Black, white, Latino, Native, Asian, and mixed students. And mixed is a category that we use because Harvard has they started their first club, right? The Harvard University Mixed Student Union, but mixed means biracial and multiracial students. And I just set out to interview as many students as possible. And my team and I worked with graduate students for the first time, interviewed 125 undergraduates. And they sat for about 175 sessions. So some people, their interview had to be done over 2 or 3 sessions. And we just really just dug into their experience. And it was both, it was eye-opening and disheartening
Mm,
sitting with students for hours upon end and hearing their experiences. Because it was important for me that this book not be just about COVID, but rather the very inequalities that that COVID exacerbated and
mm,
that universities were ignoring. So much of this book was about, okay, take me through almost like the year or two before COVID hit.
mm,
Take me to that moment and then bring me up to the present day. That's why in this book, I talk about family, finances, and the fault lines around race on campus,
mhm,
because I wanted to understand how, one, the inequality outside the college gates pierced the college bubble, a term that I think we should retire. I wanted to understand how work was affected. I didn't give up that hope. And I also wanted to understand those micro interactions along racial lines on campus. And so
mhm.
some of that was emergent, some of that we went in going, and it crafted a narrative that allowed me to really give a more well-rounded perspective of what happened to students during COVID closures, but
Mm,
that really was about the connection between before and during this moment.
totally. All right, I've got more questions on that later.
Okay.
First, though, I want to hear a little bit about the pandemic context of the research. Give us a kind of behind the scenes look at what it was like to be trying to interview people, many of whom were strangers to you,
Mhm.
during the height of this crisis. What were some of the challenges or opportunities?
To be honest with you, I was a little bit afraid to do interviews virtually because it had to be virtual. Like, I think 99% of the interviews I did were virtual. I got to meet a few students in person, but the vast majority of all the interviews were virtual. And I was afraid because I'm a person who, when I did my first book and other projects, you know, I talk to people, right? That sitting across the room, or them sitting on my couch. That first interview, they would sit up kind of straight, but then by the halfway point, they would be lounging, and then they would come back for that second interview. They would put their feet up on, not feet up on the chair, but they would sit. They would lay out and just,
Yeah.
I saw the progression of their comfort, and the more comfortable they were, the more comfortable I was, right?
Mhm.
And I thought I would miss that. I thought I would miss being that kind of kind of like the gregarious person, like the some people say, "Oh my God, you're like my big brother," or "You're like a big teddy bear. I can just tell you anything." And whatever it is that made them feel comfortable, whatever they put on to project onto me, I wanted to be able to be there. But I needed not worry, have had the worries that I had, because students really opened up. I think
Mm,
because of the time in which I was doing it, students both had not much to do, and they were looking for a break from everything they did have to do.
Yeah.
And so when we were doing these interviews, I think what I learned about most was actually, so one of my graduate students went and got an MBA before coming to school with her
Mhm.
PhD. And so she taught me about like how marketing emails go out, and they have like the science behind the timing of sending out emails. And so we started adopting those techniques, and we saw an uptick in respondents signing up for interview sessions. And so it was more of a learning of adapting to this new medium. And
Yeah.
to be honest with you, what I learned the most about myself was I knew I couldn't do interviews the same way I did for my first book project. And the reason why I say that is because in that book project, I was doing interviews at 9, noon, 3, and 6 p.m. Like, I
Oh
was
my
doing
goodness.
3 to 4 interviews every single day, two and a
Yeah.
half hour sessions with each person. I was also teaching.
Yeah.
I was also taking care of my family, albeit from afar. I
Yeah.
had more responsibilities now. So I knew that I had to take care of myself in a new way, because I was teaching online. I was connecting with my family online. I was watching the news. And so I also had to do things to make sure that I was okay.
Mhm.
Uh, And those were the things that I learned about the most. But when it got down to it, the interviews for me, I tried to approach them the exact same way. Um, you know, we joked, we had conversation before we started. Um, Sometimes the interviews would end and the student would keep talking and talking for like 35, 45 minutes, and the interview would just keep on going. And I think there was a level of comfort. And other scholars have wrote about like the perils and profits in some respects of doing interviews virtually during lockdown situations and the like. But it was very, at that time we weren't doing it. The one good thing is I was very lucky to have been familiar with Zoom because
Mm,
of my TED talk and TED training, that I understood a little bit of the mechanics of it, and that made me feel more comfortable, right? And I think the underlying thing with all of this is the more at ease you can be in a situation where you are forced to take on this, researcher hat, the
mhm,
better the interview will be. Um, but yeah, I mean, there were times where students got the time wrong. So one student signed up for a 9 a.m. session, but it
mhm,
was 6 a.m. her time.
mm,
And just also like seeing the light start to come in
yeah.
where she was, and how that also played into the experience, right? And I talk about how interviews are like ethnographic moments, right?
Mhm.
I'm immersed in their world, and I know all the ethnographers are gonna be like, what? No, I'm talking about it in a more general sense, right? In that moment, the only thing that exists for me is them and the world that they're creating for me. I'm trying, and I'm understanding their manners. I'm watching their bodies. I'm watching the tone of their voice. I'm paying attention to certain things. And I thought I would lose that virtually, but in some respects, I not only did not lose it, I was able to return to it.
Mhm.
Because with the interviews being recorded, I went back and watched the interviews. I went back and I say this in the appendix. I started narrating when students would cry or smile
Mhm.
or laugh or have a moment of like quizzical look on their face.
Yeah.
And then I would go back, and at the transcription, I would literally control F,
Uh-huh.
so to speak. I would go back and search for moments when I'm chronicling a person. When did they cry? At what moment did that turn? And go back and watch, not to watch them cry, but to see what was the progression of emotion on their face so that I can portray that in the book as well.
Yeah.
And so working with transcription to help me chronicle it, I was able to return to it and not just note it in my notes and say, oh, person started to cry. When talking about parents, I could talk about, was it a cry? Was it a sob? Was it a whimper? Were they bawling? And those were just like the details that I was able to return to because of Zoom. So there were initial fears. There were
Mm,
certain things that were lost, right? Sometimes I felt bad that I couldn't hand this person a tissue, like because I always had something in my office, even a pillow that they can hold.
mhm.
But eventually I realized that what I lost in being able to help students in the moment, I gained in being able to give them a much fuller description and a more detailed depiction of who they are, what they were going through, and what they need.
Yeah, the detail, the visual detail you were just describing, is certainly something that stood out to me as I was reading the book. And I think, especially considering the fact that this was based on Zoom interviews, not even in-person observations, the narrative is really beautiful. It reads like a story. And that brings me to another question I wanted to ask you about, which is who's the audience? Who did you have in mind as you were writing the book? Um, because the narrative strikes me as not your average interview study.
Should I take that as a compliment?
Oh, it should be the highest compliment.
Look, I get in sometimes I get in trouble for this, but articles and books are different. The audience will always be different. When I write an article, right? When I write for sociology of education, when I write for social problems, or those are my like target spots, I know I'm speaking to other academics, right? And specifically sociologists or social sciences interested in equality. When I'm writing a book, right, I could say, yes, I am definitely writing. Um, my first audience, to be honest, is the students, right? Because in my first book, I gave students, I'll put it this way, I'll never forget the early moments of sharing my work when students said, your work is the first thing that I've read about me that didn't make me feel bad, that I couldn't understand my experience, that I felt alienated from it. Like your work helped me come to terms with what was going on in my life and stuff like that. Right? You gave me a vocabulary to talk about my experience. I will always and forever, when I write about education, put students as the first and primary audience. Because oftentimes, so many students will say, oh, I thought I was the only one. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Sociologists have written about that for a long time, right? The because people don't want to share certain struggles that they think they're the only ones, especially because they think they're the only one who is struggling. We have this notion, and then when, as a researcher, when we collect these stories, right, we are able to show patterns, and I wanted to present it in a humane way. But I will also say, like, I write books, and I think we should write books to be consumed, right? That means anybody who would pick up a book or who can pick up a book, we should be able to communicate with them, right? And I think I use communication in particular. Right? There's one thing to write well and another thing to communicate, right? Communicate, I think, means that you take that extra step to think about audience. When I think about Tressie McMillan Collins, right? When I think about how accessible their work is, when I think about um, people who, it's not just about translating the work, it's about speaking about complex issues in such a way that people can engage with it. That to me is incredibly important. And I didn't grow up in posh schools, right? I didn't grow up, I used posh schools purposely. Like I never used the word posh till I got to college. Right. I didn't grow up in those schools. I had 1 year at a prep school because I had a football coach who liked who hated student athletes but loved athlete students. That's how I ended up at the prep school and saw a different thing. I didn't grow up with a whole bunch of books in the house, or people using certain vocabulary words. And so I'm like, why would I try to adopt a language that so many people don't have access to until they are very far along in their life? And on top of that, see it as a weapon being used against them, right? I've said it before. I have a general rule. If my mama can't read it, I don't want to write it. And some people may say, like, oh, that's so simplistic. That's like, like childish. I'm like, no, writing simply and accessibly is much harder than relying on jargon and shorthand to get your point across. It is sometimes harder to write a New York Times op-ed than it is to write certain things within the academy when you think about the full audience of who you have to talk with and engage with. And so when I write this book, there are three people who I have in mind, right? I have the student whose work I'm chronicling. I have the people in that student's life who can have a direct impact, whether that's a professor, a college president, or a dean. Because my work, I've been very fortunate to be able to engage with people and actually change policy, right? More than 80 colleges have changed their dining hall policies because of the privileged poor. Faculty members from community colleges to regional comprehensives to state universities to liberal arts colleges are now defining office hours on their syllabi and in their first day of classes after reading the privileged poor, right? So why would I stop? Like, why would I stop my thinking about who my work is for to just other people who study Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. It doesn't kind of make sense to me. Other people have different opinion, and that's all well and good. I just think that, we can have a bigger impact if people actually knew what the hell we're talking about. And then, of course, the third group is consumers, right? That person who's in the airport, or that person who's a little bit nerdy, who always liked sociology in college and still keeps up with new things. That's just important to me. And the last thing I would say with this, I love LeVar Burton reads. I'm so sad that the podcast ended, but after all those seasons, I was introduced to writers who, in such a short period of time, can create an entire world.
Mm.
And the reason why they were able to do so is because there was not a single word wasted.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always inspired to be able to, I was inspired to write better. Because during the pandemic, during lockdown, in discovering that podcast, I have an entire shelf of books in my house dedicated just to those authors who I was introduced to through that podcast. And it has been spiraling since then to be able to learn of this generation of writers who do things with words that I just am astounded by. To read both fiction and nonfiction and understand more intimately the written word. I just feel that I'm still growing as a scholar, and hopefully I can continue to get better as a communicator and as a writer.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing that. Question for you about the privileged poor. I'm curious how you're thinking about the relationship between these two books. Are there ways that your approach to this research or this book has been inspired by the privileged poor, or any specific ways that you kind of see this research building on your previous work?
Yeah. One thing I didn't want to do is write Privileged Poor Part 2, right? That wasn't exciting. That was never my intention. That was never, a lot of sociologists would be
Privileged
like,
poor, the
oh,
pandemic edition.
yeah, like, oh, just like study them 2 years down the line. I'm like, okay, well, that is a project, but that's also what other, what other people do. Is like, okay, does this apply in this context, how does it play out over time? And we can do that. That's great. And I will do follow-up and I will do stuff like that. But for me, the one thing I want the privileged poor to do is talk about students' lives off campus, right? The previous. And I do that enough, and I focus on the high school differences and how that shaped their time in college.
Yeah.
But one thing I ended the book with, and that was important to me, is to show how the inequality outside the gates do not stay there when students move to college, right? As I say, in the same way how there are more things that are brought to college than extra long twin sheets, right? And for me, Class Dismissed picks up something that the privileged poor touched on but didn't go into detail. Is what are the ways in which the inequalities of home come to school with students? And I'm also using this book, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of get people to retire the not only antiquated but the inadequate metaphor of the college bubble, because of how it operates in practice and how it makes this false image of this campus being a protective place, a protective and protected place. And the COVID-19 pandemic and closures completely just shut that down, right? But it wasn't even just that, right? So in the book, I have a chapter called Pink Slips for Some. And it talks about the ways in which students who feel more comfortable engaging faculty were able to get life of the mind jobs like research assistant, teaching assistant, and course assistant. Lower income students, especially disadvantaged, who are least comfortable engaging faculty, sought out jobs like barista and the like. This book reveals that segregated job market on campus, because oftentimes the most the most like quote unquote white collar equivalent jobs don't
Mhm.
even have postings. Like faculty like literally tap students and say, hey, come work with me. By exposing how there's a class segregated labor market on campus, that was the first step, but I was also able to show the way in which that there were uneven consequences of that because when COVID shut down campus, middle class students disproportionately kept working. They
Mm.
even got more hours because teaching assistants were even in more demand versus lower income students who had like job at, as a barista at the local cafe, completely lost out on all the hours, but they needed the money. And I showed the way in which what were the consequences of it. So the so to me, the privileged poor was about exposing the overlooked diversity among lower income students.
Mm.
This book is about understanding the way that the entrenched inequalities of home are exacerbated by campus policies and were made even worse by
Mm.
the COVID-19 pandemic. Another quick example is, and I talk about this at pretty good length in the book, is academic leave policies.
Yeah.
If a student voluntarily wants to take an unpaid internship, right, and just go out and go to the White House or go work for their father's company or whatever, the only thing they have to do is send an email saying, hey, I'm not coming back next semester. I'll be back in the fall.
Mhm.
Done. But when students have hard times, often because of what is taxing their energy and minds off campus, like deaths at home, working extra hours to pay the bills, other forms of inequities.
Mhm.
Their grades tend to slip, and we see this. When you are dismissed from school, oftentimes because of not a mishandling of work, but of not knowing how to handle the dual responsibility of student and child,
Yeah.
you have to do it's like being put on parole, but yeah, equivalent. Yeah, it's like being put on a parole. Some schools require you to work a full-time job and take classes at a local school and have your boss write a letter of recommendation.
Mm.
But if you're the only person in your community who speaks English, or you're one of the few people who ever been to college, and only like 50% of the people in the community which you come from work because there are no jobs. Like I say, you come from a rural environment, a reservation, or certain center cities where jobs have gone. How are you going to comply with these very punitive, not palliative policies?
Mm.
And so that's why, again, this book is not just about COVID, but
Mhm.
it shows the ways in which the policies that exist on the college campus were shown just how unequal they are when
Mhm.
campus closures happen. Because when students had to leave, or when students were trying to make it back on campus, many schools did not relax those rules. They still require students to try to find work, even during the pandemic, to show their worth about returning to campus. There's a whole host of things that we engage with and try to figure out and understand, like, how are the policies that we have that even when we have them as, oh, this will help you, it actually only serves to hurt the most vulnerable.
Mm.
So the privileged poor was 100% life on campus, peers, professors, and university policies. This book is about how what happens off campus directly affects what happens on, using the pandemic as like this larger context to understanding how universities were ignoring the
Mm.
very inequalities that were deepened and left so many vulnerable students like just out in the cold, alone, braving the storm.
I'm curious about, so you mentioned earlier that initially the project you had hoped would be comparative across different types of
Mhm.
universities. And so I'm curious if you've thought at all about, or maybe seen kind of anecdotally, how things played out for lower income students at other universities, especially more broad
Hmm.
access or less resourced institutions.
Yeah, I did speak to other students at other universities. One of the good things about the undergrads that I did hire to work with me, they came from other schools. So I worked with students at Morehouse, at Emory, at Amherst College, at Simmons. So a range of schools, HBCU, a small liberal arts college, and there were other students from different schools as well. One student came from Cal Poly Pomona, CSU Fullerton. And so I had a range of students who worked with me on the project. And so we were able to have both conversations. And I did, of course, read the news, stayed on social media. The thing is, there are two things. I want to study what were the experience of lower income students at the heart of what I want to do. And because of the pandemic, I didn't have access to other institutions, but I don't think that there is anything wrong with studying at certain schools, because I think about the work of Seamus Khan and others, and they make a very good point. If we are truly to understand inequality, especially in America, we can not only study poor people in poor places. That leaves so much of the inequality generating places and people completely completely, unchecked and understudied. And I think that's also that is very important. And given that the book is at Harvard University, people always say, well, Harvard is so unique in the landscape. What could possibly be done? But that's also why I surveyed so many schools' academic leave policies, which is why I surveyed statements and look at configurations of everything from how they handle on-campus jobs. Right, there are things that you can do to have your base be your base, but understand what is the larger landscape. I am sure that lower income students at Harvard had a slightly different experience than students at a rich but not as rich schools, and a very different experience on some things at other schools. And yet, at the same time, the underlying principles of how jobs are selected and who gets what jobs, race relations on campus, these things played out across higher education, and we saw that. And so to be able to uncover certain things. Now, I could have said all of this in a very academic way and say there is a thing called theoretical sampling, and we need to do more of it, right? Choose your site that allows you to speak beyond your case. What are the conditions under which you believe that your theory or your understanding plays out and tested at that site? Harvard fit those criteria. I wanted a residential college. I wanted to remove loans or financial aid as a factor for persistence or graduation, right? I wanted to understand how, particularly these schools that are celebrating majority minority classes and the most diverse class ever, and yada, 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 all these admission milestones, handled it. Because as I say in the book, it is very interesting that in 2017, many of the universities, select universities, were celebrating their first majority minority classes or making markers, setting new marks for diversity. Were the same colleges, that was the same class that were juniors when COVID-19 hit. So to understand how these universities with unprecedented diversity were hit with an unprecedented pandemic, how did they handle it? Are you welcoming diversity, or are you preparing yourself for it? Because those are two different things. So academically, look up any article on theoretical sampling. But personally, I wanted to understand how a specific set of universities were also being part of this national movement about conversation about diversity in higher education and access, and really trying to get people to truly think beyond the financial aid package.
Great. Thanks for the 2-level answers. I appreciate it.
I mean, I think people sometimes forget that just because you can write accessibly doesn't mean that you don't understand the theoretical foundations under which you speak. Right?
Oh, you
Just
have
because
plenty of appendix in this book.
Oh yeah.
Anyone's worried about that.
No, because it's some people are like, well, what definition of cultural capital are you using, like, is it this version or this version or this version? And you know the literature, you know all the people who are doing it. But when you write about it and you say, well, cultural capital can be taken as those taken for granted ways that are privileged and taken for granted ways that are valued in a particular context, right? That's a summation of the research. But to somebody who's not as familiar with the whole legacy of Bourdieu, Louis, DiMaggio, Leroux, Calarco, and keep going, like you have, just because you frame it in a more accessible way doesn't mean you know the theoretical foundation on which you are building, which I think sometimes gets into trouble. So, whatever.
For sure. All right, before we wrap up, one last question. Overall, what do you hope university leaders will take away from this book, and what do you hope the rest of us will take away?
I hope university leaders take a hard look at those like very mundane everyday policies that they just you know um, continue to enforce without real critical thinking. I think that'd be very, very important. Again, from academic leave policies to job placement to how you handle race, and that's the reason why, again, yes, I focus on Harvard because that's where I did the study, but I also highlight policies that are actually, I think, models for higher education. The University of Rochester has an amazing program that's been around for decades called the Take Five Initiative. I think the Take Five Initiative, Take Five program, where they break out from the four and out model because they know that lower income and first generation college students face undue burdens while they are progressing through higher education. Similarly, Stanford has a program in which they offer students a much easier um, uh, a much easier opportunity to apply for an extra semester because when life happens, right? I think so. Even though I focus on one school, my survey of other institutions, both public and private, big and small, allows me to highlight models that I think other universities can draw from. And so I hope that we take we take we take a close look at, not, I don't want to say take a close look at the student handbook, that's too reductionistic, but to really just look at how university policies that we are like just continuing to persist are perpetuating and sometimes exacerbating inequality on the campus, especially because many of those policies were created when colleges looked very different.
Mm.
And for everybody else, I want us to fully understand what it means to be a college student today, right? The inequalities that we got a closer and a much more intimate view of from the COVID-19 pandemic are still around because many communities are still suffering from them. One of the things that I was so fortunate about is to interview Native students as part of this project, because I think the universities do not pay enough attention to Native students. And as an extension of that, I would also say students from like rural backgrounds in certain places, and it's like completely blind to the experiences of certain groups of students. And I want their stories to kind of light a fire under us all to pay attention to more than just the inequalities that get the attention on the news. Because when students come to campus, it's a lot that we take for granted that a financial aid package solves. And that's just not what's going on. Like I said, this book used COVID, yes, as that stress test, but it is so much more focused on what students were dealing with before the pandemic that universities were already failing them on, and how it just got so much worse. And they felt even more alone, even more abandoned by the place that claims they want them, the place that begged them to come and put up every kind of show of support. And then when they got here and when they needed the most, they vanished.
Well said. Having read the book, I can affirm that on the one hand, it's a book about the pandemic, but on the other hand, it's not a book about the pandemic. Right? All right. Well, thank you. Those are all the questions that I had for you. I appreciate the behind the scenes chat and congratulations again on the publication.
Thank you.
Take care.